Thanks for listening to this podcast of Trending with Timmerie. If you haven't already subscribed, please catch us wherever you love to listen to your podcast, from the Relevant Radio app to Apple, YouTube, you name it, we are there. And if you listen on Apple Podcasts, please be sure to go and give us a 5-star review to help other people discover the podcast. Anything you share in terms of episodes, whether it's texting it to a friend, posting on social media, helps to build up the kingdom for God, to help confront the challenging issues we face as a culture, but with joy, with hope, and with an eternal perspective where our faith collides with everyday life, bringing eternal principles to help us live our life joyfully.
So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio.
It's our weekly marriage hour, and we have some hot questions coming in. Perhaps you have a question for this marriage hour. The number's 1-888-914-9149. Taking everything from dating, relationships, and marriage itself. Would love to hear your thoughts. You can also ask a question now on my Instagram at Timmerie. That's Timmerie. We're going to unpack the primary needs of men and the primary needs of women within the context of marriage. We're taking questions. An interesting question came in about single moms that I want to jump on. And we'll also dive into, in a culture where women are pressed to get right back to work. Women are told that raising your children is a waste of time. It depletes your skills. So many things are said. We're going to talk about how motherhood inspires creative work. I saw a fascinating article by an attorney who's a full-time mom and a part-time lawyer, and she had some fascinating things to say about how motherhood has enhanced not just her as a human being, but also the things that she does outside of being a mother as well, and how that forms and informs one another. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. Joining me now is Devin Schadt. He's the founder of the Fathers of St. Joseph, and he also is a author of a number of books, everything from a Consecration of St. Joseph book, which we've been talking quite a bit about recently, as well as books that will help you in taking responsibility and ownership and growing in your faith. So check him out at fathersofstjoseph.org. That's Fathers of St. Joseph.org. Devin, welcome back to Trending. I'm excited to dive into this topic of meeting each other's needs, their primary needs in marriage. We'll talk about it from the perspective of what a woman needs most in marriage and what a husband needs most in marriage. And no, it's not sex. That's not what we're going for today. There are other primary needs that come first, much to some dismay and confusion. But Devin, welcome to Trending. I'm really looking forward to diving into this primary need of a man in the context of marriage.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Timmerie.
Let's, kind of unpack this. I do find it fascinating. What is that number one thing that not just married men, but that all men, especially, as they come out of their teen years into adulthood, primarily need from women?
Yeah, and as you said, believe it or not, it's not sex. It's actually respect. It's that feeling of deep admiration for, when you have that feeling of deep admiration for someone, for their abilities, their qualities, their achievement, their person. And every man, when he is respected, he grows. He grows in confidence, competence, and courage. But when he doesn't have that, he kind of languishes and even dies, and he'll have a disordered kind of behavior to try to obtain that in disordered ways.
It's interesting how even in just hearing you say that, I immediately think of St. Paul, how St. Paul's direction toward men when he talks about marriage in Ephesians chapter 5 is when he talks to men and women, he gives each of them different things that they're called to do. And what he speaks to women, he says, mutually to spouses in Ephesians 5, chapter 5, verse 21, be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. And here we see, and we'll unpack this a little bit more, that, many people don't have a problem with that when you think of the idea that Jesus said that he's come not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. It's a reminder that marriage is at the service of one another, and that's a perspective shift that we all need. But then you read in Ephesians chapter 5 that then St. Paul says that there's a subjection that is more intense among wives to their husbands. He says, wives, be subject to your husbands as to the Lord. That's one of those oof moments where I think
Oh,
poor
yeah.
priests are probably like ducking when they have to read this text and then avoid mentioning it whatsoever in their homily.
Yeah.
But, it's easy when we read and understand sub means under, submission means to be under the same mission. But at the same time, that's a mission that a wife is meant to enter into, and there's an authority of the husband, of the spouse in that marriage. And what's significant, why I bring this up, Devin, is for those who maybe have heard that passage and haven't really thought about it, what's significant is St. Paul knew in our human frailty and in our human needs that the primary need of a man was respect, but that it was
Mm.
also God ordained that he would be the leader and that he would have that God-given role to lead. But there's this almost correction, but at the same time, invitation for a wife to enter into that level of respect that is so counterintuitive to 21st century feminism.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, you said a lot there, and actually, it's incredible. I think it takes us back to Genesis, actually, where, before Eve was even created, God gave Adam a series of commands to till and keep the garden. And that word to till is to cherish in the Hebrew. And so that means to protect and care for, to hold something dear. And garden in the Hebrew literature often refers to woman. And so Adam wasn't just in charge of a plot of land, but he was in charge of caring and cherishing for woman. And part of that was that when God gave him all these commands, especially regarding the tree of the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that Eve didn't exist, which is kind of a scary thought for all of us as men and women, because what it means is that Adam was not only called to provide, to protect, but then to be a priest, to transmit the commands of the Lord. And then we see that Eve didn't obey the command. I think it's because Adam really didn't step up. I think that he needed to step up. That's my conjecture there. But I believe, though, that when she disobeyed, did you notice that the curse was, now you will be subject to the dominion of your husband? And we're like, oh my gosh, that's awful. But I think what God's doing is he's like saying, look, both of you need to learn a lesson. Men, Adam, you need to learn how to lead sacrificially and assume that responsibility to even die for your wife if necessary to protect her from Satan and from the world and all its allurements. And women, you need to listen to your husbands if they're really the priest of the family in a good way. And so I think that that's the kind of the dilemma that we're all in is like, how's that work together? Because wives don't want to be dominated by their husbands, and men have dominion over them, which is false. But at the same time, men want to be respected for what you said was their spiritual leadership, which I really believe can be summed up in sacrificial responsibility, the responsibility to set the pace of sacrificial love for his wife and for his family.
It's as simple, and I've seen this in the few years my husband and I have been married. My husband will look at me sometimes and just put his hand up and he'll say, Timmerie, I've got this. Just let it go. Let me lead. Let me initiate. Because when we as women try to domineer things, when we pick and nag and don't allow our husbands to lead, they'll shut down eventually. I mean, you guys won't do something because for so long we've butted in that finally go, okay, fine, go for it. There's either this constant clashing or that there's that stepping back. And I know this is such a sensitive topic for many people, Devin, but I think one of the perspectives I think that is so important to dive into is how to regain that type of relationship, this biblical idea, this biblical goal of marriage in a broken feminist 21st century era when the idea of being in any way subject to your spouse is in direct conflict with the brainwashing of feminism that we are all guilty of having experienced in the culture. And it, in a certain respect, is opposite of our own natural inclination to kind of do our own thing and charge out. And even when you understand you might be able to do something better than your spouse doesn't mean that you have to be the one to do it. I might change a diaper better than my husband. Actually, I think my husband's probably better at changing diapers. But it doesn't mean that I have to change every diaper, even though he would probably be really happy if I did.
Yeah. Well, I think that's great. I think that if we look at men are doers. I mean, Joseph did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. And then Mary, she says, let it be done. So we see in the masculine soul, there's this doing. And I think that really works with this idea of respect, because we're respected, and we want women to respect us, particularly our wives, for our abilities, our qualities, and our achievements, okay, for what we do, okay? Not just for who we are, but what we do. And then women, though, it's like, let it be done. Cherish me, hold me dear, protect me. And so there's this complementarity. And I think that this is really, at the basic, if we can get down to the foundation of it, sexual difference is real. Sexual difference matters. So sexual difference indicates that a man and a woman at the core of their being are different, though they're made of the same stuff, body and soul. They're different, but that sexual difference in a way indicates a type of deficiency, a good deficiency where they need each other to complete each other. And so sexual difference summons men and women to overcome their personal deficiencies through self-giving love to help to complement and complete each other. So if we know that this isn't the zero-sum fallacy, like, okay, if I give a little bit to love to you, there's only 10 pieces of the pie here, or 8 pieces of the pie. If I give 4 pieces of the pie, there's only 4 left. Am I going to get them? No. Love exponentially grows. So the more that I give, actually, the more I'm going to get in return. As St. John the Cross says, where there is no love, put love, and there will be love. Love grows exponentially. And so what we have to realize is, if at the basis of this cherished respecting the needs of men and women is this idea of trust. And so there's baby steps, because we've been wounded in this area, right?
Yes, right. And I'm excited to dive more into that perspective of what a woman's need is in being cherished, because I think that when she's cherished, that's what helps to allow her to be able to respect. But as I remember in an article written by the political commentary Matt Walsh, he wrote an article probably about 8 years ago. And the article was about this topic of men needing respect and men being called to be leaders in the home. And he talked about how when he first got married to his wife, he had no idea how to lead his family. And he had no clue. And he was a brand new married man. You have this responsibility. You don't know how to make it happen necessarily from day one. And he spoke volumes of how his wife, even when he didn't earn it or didn't maybe even seemingly deserve it, she always showed him both respect and the space to figure out how to lead. And he talks about how he's the leader he is today because his wife gave him that space as he was floundering to figure it out. She gave him that space and never made him feel like he had to earn her respect. And it's an important reminder. We tend to think, in our culture today, well, this person will earn my trust, or this person will earn X, Y, and Z from me. But we can't have that mindset in marriage. That's the exact opposite mindset that we should have in marriage. We should have already earned that in the dating process when we determined whether or not we were going to say I do on the altar, or before we even said yes to that ring. This is why I think these perspectives, sometimes people get offended that we're saying you're called to respect your spouse. But in reality is, the moment you said yes to that engagement ring and I do at the altar, you had a commitment to whether or not they earned it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the big kind of missing piece to the puzzle is that there's going to be times where we're trying to actually be men. Men a lot of times are boys trapped in men's bodies. So we're on this kind of trajectory where we're actually trying to find ourselves, trying to become the men that we're supposed to be. And we're struggling to figure that out because there's been generations that have not taught us. And so we get married, and marriage ends up becoming kind of like an initiating rite in a way. And so then we tackle projects and things like that. And I've seen it happen in my friends' marriages where the wife will demean the husband. You did it wrong, or you never do anything right, or you're not getting to this or getting to that. And they shut down. But it's the wife who's patient. It's the wife who trusts that eventually he'll get it. Eventually he'll come through. that's the guy who grows in competence and confidence.
Yes, yes. And I'm guilty of the former. I am guilty of, it being frustrated. Man, you didn't do the dishes the way I wanted to, the system I have, or whatever it might be. I am so guilty of this, but I am doing myself a disservice when I do that, because when he either shuts down, he becomes frustrated with me. It causes a conflict between us. Or maybe he just doesn't want to do whatever that item or thing might be at all. And I've lost maybe that support because of my incessant nagging. We are so guilty of this as women in the culture. This is why we need this reminder for respect. Devin Schadt here on Trending from the Fathers of St. Joseph. Let's talk about some very practical ways that women can enter into respect, because for me, this is something that our culture doesn't teach. It's not modeled to us at all, unless you have really good examples of role models where you see this on a regular basis in a couple's marriage. And I think that those tips are important. There's a book I read it's called For Women Only by Shanti Feldhahn. She talks about some of those 5 primary things for men that they need, and the first one, of course, being respect. And she gives kind of this how-to list on how to start working on that. And some of it was really simple, and there were things, Devin, that I never really would have thought of. First, I think is simple, and you can think of it, and that is, respecting and seeking the opinion of your husband, and actually, encouraging those thoughts and ideas that he has, rather than always jumping to and sharing your own. So it first starts with creating that space to appreciate what the other person has to think and say. But then it also turns into this level of deferring to your husband in matters, or even in public. This is a big one that I learned, being careful how you talk about your spouse. A story that you might find funny about your spouse, although it might be funny to him, might not be so funny if you share it in public in front of other people. I know that's a lesson I had to learn, and I just didn't get it, Devin. But it matters, and maybe you can speak a little bit more from a male perspective to this.
Well, yeah, a friend of mine, good friend, his wife was kind of the decision maker in their family, and they were on a road trip vacation, and kids are in the car, and they're trying to figure out where they're going to stop to eat. And, the wife said to the husband, I think I'd like you to start taking up the leadership of the family. And he said up to that point, it was great because if they made the decisions, his wife or the kids, he could blame them for picking the wrong restaurant, right? But then suddenly it was like thrown in his lap. And so, but what he found out was by taking that responsibility, he wasn't making the decision, where do I want to go? He started to think, what would be best for everyone else, not him. And that's the way he's lived his life. He now that he has that sacrificial responsibility, this spiritual leadership, if you will, of his family, he's always looking to what's best for his wife, how he can cherish her, how he can meet her needs. But I think that the key here is that in solid marriages, in intimate, joy-filled, trusting marriages, there's a massive key that most people miss. And I think it's the expression of needs to one another. And when a husband and wife cannot express their needs in a trusting environment, and we're talking about heartfelt needs, then eventually they become distant and eventually they shut down. And we see this in our Lord. Our Lord from the cross says, I thirst. He is the bridegroom saying to the bride, he's saying, I thirst for you. I need you. Quench me with your love. And then you got Mary, who is the pinnacle of the bride at the wedding at Cana. She says, they have no wine. I have a need. They have a need. Only you, my bridegroom, can fill. I need you. And so we see this complementarity of expression of needs, right? And so that's biblical. So when we start to get over our pride, our lack of humility, and the sphere of vulnerability, and actually open ourselves to express our needs to one another, not saying, hey, look, you don't do this for me, you don't do that, and this is what I need. No. Not talking about the spouse, but saying, this is an authentic, deep need of mine. And it gives the other person the opportunity to say, well, you know what? I can try and address that. Now, also, when we communicate needs, though, we need to communicate them without the expectation that somehow my spouse is going to be God, that is going to fulfill every one of my wishes, is going to come through for me.
Or be perfect.
Yeah, Christopher West used to say, you can't hang a hat on a hook that can't bear the weight. And I agree with that. It's like, I did that to my wife early on, I get married and expecting, hey, she's going to love me and I'm going to feel loved all the time and all that. And, it's break her, man, so eventually you figure out, oh, wait a minute, that's not how it works. But by expressing my needs, I give her the opportunity to at least address them. And then when I see her putting that effort in to addressing my needs, then I love her even more and I want to address her needs. And then what happens is you have this escalating growth cycle where people are trying to, in a sense, outdo one another in love by addressing needs.
And those needs are so primary and so important and appealing to how does your husband specifically feel disrespected by you? Ask this question and be prepared for an answer that will feel uncomfortable. My husband and I have had these conversations a couple of times, and it's been hard to swallow. But and maybe you want to fight when you have the conversation, and maybe it turns into
Oh,
a fight.
yeah.
But it's humbling, it's eye-opening, and if you really care, it is so good for your marriage. Devin Schadt from Fathers of St. Joseph, you can find him at fathersofstjoseph.org. We're including links to a ton of these resources we're mentioning, including a link to that blog by Matt Walsh, Your Husband Doesn't Have to Earn Your Respect. It was so enlightening for me to read years ago before I ever got married, because it was a perspective kind of slap in the face that I needed, even while I was dating, when it came to respecting my now husband, who I was dating at the time. And I think that there's a lot of really good resources to help us truly in training ourselves against the cultural attitude of disrespect and irreverence toward men, but instead honoring their opinions, honoring, even deferring to them at times, honoring how we speak of them in public. It's hard, but it's a shift that we have to make because, as you're saying, Devin, it is a primary need for men. In fact, studies have shown that men would rather feel unloved than feel disrespected. They would rather be respected than they would rather be loved. And that speaks volumes. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. We're going to come back during our weekly marriage hour today with Devin Schadt. We're going to talk about meeting the primary needs of each other in marriage, but this time we'll talk about what the wife's primary need is. Maybe you can take a guess. You can answer the question on my Instagram now at Timmerie, Timmerie, with your questions, thoughts, or your guess of what do you think that primary need is for women, or what have you found it has been for your spouse. We'll be right back here on Trending during our weekly marriage hour.
So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
Devin Schadt, author and founder of the Fathers of St. Joseph, is joining me now during our weekly marriage hour. Check him out at fathersofstjoseph.org. We've included a link on social media as well as in the podcast notes available tonight, because you can share this episode with other people. We're diving during this marriage hour into what are the primary needs of men and women and how that plays out within the context of marriage. We've unpacked the primary need of a man to be respected. In fact, men would rather be unloved but respected. Literally, that's how important respect is to a man. Fascinating. Shifting gears here, though, and I think what helps us as women to respect our men is actually when our primary need is met. Doesn't mean that we should hold out and showing respect to our spouses. Hey, you chose to marry him. That means that you are responsible for respecting him. But Devin, can you help us unpack this primary need for women, which is to be cherished, that idea to be cherished and loved, simultaneously, really the same thing, and how you've seen this has been fundamental for you in your marriage?
Well, yeah, absolutely. So, to cherish, right, is to protect and care, to hold something dear. And we see this in, Genesis. I mean, woman is the pinnacle of the created order. She's the queen. She's the most beautiful. She's the life bearer. And Adam, he's called to protect her, to defend her from everything he can in order for her to thrive. And so you see this right away when Eve is created. The first thing that she sees is a man rejoicing in her. She doesn't see the wilderness like Adam did. She sees a man saying, whoa, this is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. And so for her, her construct, or her context is a social one, a social dynamic. She is a social being, and she loves to be cherished. And we see that right there in Genesis. And so men, we have to step up and figure out how to cherish our wives and to make them, in a sense, the pinnacle of our lives. She is which is of most value. And I see this a lot in marriages where after a couple is married for a couple of years, they start having children, then the marriage kind of goes on the back burner and all the focus is on the children. And I remember we were doing that because we had a special needs daughter very early on. She was on life support. She nearly died. Then she suffered a brain injury, and now she's confined to a wheelchair. And during that whole process, we found ourselves just scrambling to just survive. And our marriage was falling apart. And we went to this little prayer service, and this singer said to us, he was leading it, Michael John Poirier, he said, before Seth was Adam and Eve. And he said, you guys need to remember that. And that was like a really huge wake-up call for us. And I realized that my wife was not my focus. She was not number one. But then when I placed her in that top seat and I made her number one, it wasn't that zero-sum fallacy like I was taking away love from my children. I had way more love for my children, and my wife and I together had way more love for our children, and our children had way more love for us because they saw this love that we were having for one another, and they still see it to this day. And I think it's the opposite. When a husband is not respected, like you were saying before we took our break, when a husband is not respected, he's not going to cherish. He's not going to cherish his bride. And I knew someone who, man, they were big-time Catholics, a lot of kids, Latin mass goers, rosary every day, youth groups, youth rallies, all this stuff. And every single child fell away because the mom continually undermined and demeaned the husband, demeaned his leadership. And because of that, he didn't cherish her, and their love ran cold. And so we just have to be very careful about this. It complements and completes one another. He's respected. He cherishes. She cherishes. He respects. But, and this is the difficulty of sacrificial responsibility, we men have to go first. Just like I've said before in dancing, a man takes that first step. He's not a better dancer a lot of times. Doesn't mean he knows more. He just takes that first step. And it's the same thing with self-sacrificial love. The man needs to take that first step to cherish her. And there's many, many ways that men can cherish their wives and make them feel as though and know that they're the most important person in his world.
As you were speaking, it was making me think at the same time where many husbands justifiably will say, it's hard to love my wife. It's hard to love my wife. And maybe there are past wounds, or maybe there's just ongoing nagging or repetitive behavior and fighting. And just like I was saying earlier, that a husband should never have to earn his wife's respect. When she committed, when she said, I do at the altar, she had a responsibility to show respect even when he is not respectable. And it's even a fundamental thing as human beings. But the same must be said for women, Devin, that a husband must love his wife even when she's seemingly unlovable in her behavior. And I think this is a tough thing to get over in marriage, that it's almost as if again, someone has to earn something, or we're giving a spouse an award like a dog. And we're talking about meeting the primary needs of your spouses, and no, the primary need for a man is not sex. But sometimes a lot of men feel that way with the way women, spouses, dangle that over their husbands, and vice versa, with this loving attitude that that you feel like you have to give or do something in order to be loved, or in order to be respected, or in order to experience intimacy. And again, Devin, as we were talking about this, it made me think about how right St. Paul is. He gets this primordial crisis of the human person within the context of marriage, because St. Paul, just like he told wives to be subject to their husbands as to the Lord, he tells husbands to love their wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. He tells husbands, cherish your wives and lay everything down for her. don't become cold. Don't just focus on the process and the task and mission at hand. See the person before you and your wife and behold her, just as God the Father says to behold his Son. It's a fatherly thing to do, telling us that we're to behold and cherish each other here on earth.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so as men, I mean, I think for me, it really, so I think, well, let's just back up a little bit. I mean, women do want to be cherished deeply. And when they are not cherished by men, they will try to find that somewhere else. You know, I mean, by their husbands, they will try to find that somewhere else. And so we have to understand as men, what is it that women want to be cherished for? And I think the needs run from kind of a physical, more external kind of need to more of a spiritual need. And I think right off the bat, you know, when I met my wife, she was the most gorgeous woman in the world, and she still is. But when I met her, she blew my mind. Her beauty just blew my mind. And you look at what St. Paul says in Ephesians, and I think it's fantastic when he talks about the bride. He's like, husbands, love your wives, you know, basically so that she will not have blemish or spot or wrinkle. You know, that's what Christ loves the church, so that she will not have blemish, spot, or wrinkle. So what is it? The bride wants to be beautiful. And when we men are not convinced of our wives' beauty, that sends a message to them that we don't cherish them. And so for me, one of my primary goals is to express to my wife that she is the most beautiful woman in my world, and that I cherish her, not only for her physical beauty, but for everything, her internal beauty, her emotional beauty, all of that, her intellectual beauty, all the person that she is. I cherish that beauty, and that she brings life to our family. She brings life to me. And I believe, like what you said prior to the break, and I've heard my friends say this, without my wife, I would still be fumbling around, not successful, not doing the things that I'm doing, because she's given me so much courage. Not that women make men, but they inspire their man to be a real man. And I think that's beautiful. But when you have a woman who's not being cherished, she's going to default to demeaning and disrespecting. And then on the counter side, then he's going to default to not stepping up, to not being courageous, to not being a man. And then they just kind of languish.
That crisis that occurs when we aren't meeting those basic needs of how we experience love, you know, to be cherished, to be respected, for women to be seen and understood, listened to, delighted in. You know, I've been thinking a lot about that word delight, and how the very few things that we delight in as a culture, and even we miss delighting in this as a culture, are children. And you see a child and you see just their simplicity, that the smallest thing they're enamored by, they're giggling at, and it's wonderful to them. You know, me hopping from side to side and singing a silly song, and it's the best thing to my 16-month-old right now. And you see this delight. That's what, in a certain kind of way, and it's not that women want to be treated like children, but that we want that love so profoundly that we're delighted in the same way that a father delights in his daughter, you know, that parents delight in their children, that you're loving for something just for the simple, beautiful sake of that person. And you're not reducing or judging, but you're loving on the simplest level, just like you love a child right there where they're at, not expecting anything from them, not taking anything from them, but simply delighting in them in that moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, man, there's a lot there. I think we could go in a million different directions there, but I think that's really beautiful. One of the things that I think you said that I think is very powerful is that we're not trying to extract something from one another, you know, like kind of spousal bartering, you know,
Yes.
but that can happen, you know. I mean, I remember reading the 5 Love Languages, you know, Chapman, and it's a good book, you know, and it's great because it identifies the 5 love languages, and that's all great. But the default is, okay, how can I scratch your back so you'll scratch mine? And then it becomes like, and this is the key, like especially when it comes to sexual union, sexual intercourse, we put that on a table like it's kind of like a thing. We say, look, this is what I want. It's on the table. What do I have to do to get that? Rather than, I don't want the sexual intercourse. I want you. And that's a big difference. And so, but a lot of times we do this spousal bartering thing, like, well, I'll do this just so I can get that. No, I don't want that. I want you, you know?
Your husband shouldn't know why you're doing the dishes tonight or vice versa. There shouldn't be this reading into things the way that there can be in that spousal bartering that you're talking about.
Well, if I'm actually doing the dishes just because I love her, and if I'm actually doing the honeydews, or I'm making, our home a better place to live, and I'm coming through for her on a regular basis, or at least trying to address those needs of hers without looking for any reciprocal kind of gift, she's going to want to step up just naturally because she sees I'm doing it altruistically. I remember I was early on in marriage. I went to the Theology Bible Institute, and it changed my life. And John Paul II's teaching on theology was just crazy for me, just changed me totally. But before that, I didn't even realize that I was a man who was bound by lust, and especially for my wife. And I remember, receiving this teaching at JP2, and I was on vacation with my wife, and, it's bedtime, and I just decided to rub her back. Don't want anything back. Just, I'm going to do that for her. And the next morning she says, "What was that all about?" Like she's so surprised, like, "Wow, you did that just to be nice," and but she was blown away, right? And it sent a message to my brain, like, "Wow, she felt so loved because I didn't try to barter or exchange." And I think, back to that idea of delight, which is so cool. Psalm 37. I love this psalm. God says, "The one who delights in me, I will I'll give them their heart's desire. The one who delights in me, I grant their heart's desire." Now let's move that into the spousal arrangement. When we delight in our spouses, they just naturally, instinctually want to grant the spouse's heart's desire. That's the beautiful thing about delighting in your spouse. When you really start to find the reasons why you married your spouse, and you start to build on those reasons, and you start to put love where there is no love, there will be love, you begin to delight. And what happens? The other person wants to meet your heart's desires. And it's not about some kind of spousal bartering, it's some kind of exchange, but it becomes gift-centered. Totally gift-centered. And that's what's so beautiful about great marriages, is because God in Mitzvah 24, I believe, says, man becomes a sincere gift by giving himself to another. So the more I give myself to my wife, I discover more of who I am. I discover myself by being a gift. She discovers herself by being a gift to me. Our family discovers their giftedness through this giftedness of spousal love. And so it helps us with our identity, and our identity leads to our destiny, which is glory.
Now, when you're talking, there are so many directions we could take on this. And if you're just joining us, this is our weekly marriage hour here on Trending. That's Devin Schadt from the Fathers of St. Joseph. One thing that keeps standing out to me in this primary need, Devin, for women to be cherished, to be loved, is that, we think about it often. Men know this, that women need to be needed and women need to be wanted. These are things that are very important. However, sometimes I think because of our culture that puts pressure on women to perpetually be hot and available, it confuses women and what they actually need and want, and it confuses men. And well, what does she really want? I don't know. She's showing this signal, but what is it actually? So this idea that yes, it's important for women to be needed, it's important for us to be wanted, it's so important, but first we have to be cherished, because we will be better able, as you're saying, to give ourselves away.
Yeah, exactly. So let's make this super practical for guys, right? So because guys are simple, and sometimes we like theology and all that, but really how do I cherish my wife? Well,
yes.
How do I do it? How do I cherish my wife? Well, how do you make her number one? Well, it's all about, women love emotional intimacy. That means time spent with them. They love when their husband listens to them. They love it when their husband finds them to be beautiful. So here's the deal. Carve out time. You will make time for your buddies. You'll make time for your golf game. You'll make time for working out. Make time for her once a week with a date night. Every day, find 10 minutes with her. 10 minutes, just you and her, no kids, nothing else, eye to eye, and don't make her your project. She's a person, and just listen to her. Let her vent, And that can be her complaining time. If that's her complaining time, if she's gonna, reduce it to that time, that's great. But just let her go. 10 minutes and just give her your best. 10 minutes a night or whatever. Maybe morning coffee. And then I just think, affirmation. That physical affirmation without wanting anything, but also assuring her, because I think this is real. Women, as they get older, their hormones change, their bodies change. So do men, but women, it's more apparent, I think. And I think they feel the pressure because of our blasted culture, the airbrushing and all the models and all this fake stuff. And they just constantly feel the pressure that they don't add up, that they're not as beautiful as they need to be. And so we need to assure our wives over and over that they're beautiful inside and out. And so I think when we do these things, and also this is the fourth thing. So first, date night. Carve out time for her, make her a priority, spend your money on her because it's the best money you'll ever spend. 10 minutes a day, give her your ear, give her your eyeballs, and listen, and don't try to fix her. And then I think another thing too is that we in the affirmation, physical, without getting anything, trying to get anything, but then also the verbal affirmation, especially of her gifts and her talents. But then also I think fourth, it's really important that we value their input, that we value her as a source of inspiration for us. I mean, my wife, she's like the voice of the Holy Spirit, man, and she checks me all the time. And I love it because it's like, man, that is the voice of God. And it's great for me because I'm a prideful guy, and it helps me grow in humility. So what do I have to lose? So, but her wisdom always benefits me greatly. And so I think by listening to our wives and the wisdom, we actually show them that we cherish not only their bodies and not only their hair and not only their cooking, but we cherish them, their mind, their person, their soul. And man, when a bride gets all that, it's going to be really hard for her not to respect her husband.
Mm-hmm. That is very profoundly true. That's Devin Schadt from the Fathers of St. Joseph. Candid marriage advice, real, raw, and something to grow in. Growing in respect toward our husbands, and for husbands, growing and cherishing your wives. Numbers 1-888-914-9149. Taking your questions this marriage hour. Check out Fathers of St. Joseph, fathersstjoseph.org. We've included a link on social media at Timmerie.
We're talking about what you're thinking about. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
Join Father Rocky and Relevant Radio listeners from Maui to Maine in a pilgrimage walk to the National Shrine of Our Lady of Good Help on Saturday, May 7th. This growing annual 21-mile pilgrimage starts at the National Shrine of St. Joseph in Wisconsin and finishes in the only approved Marian apparition site in the United States, Our Lady of Good Help in Champion, Wisconsin. Walk part of the way, or you can walk all the way. The Walk to Mary is Saturday, May 7th. Information and registration at walktomary.com. That's walktomary.com. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie during our weekly marriage hour. Interesting questions are coming in on social media. If you have a question, you can ask it now on Instagram at Timmerie. That's Timmerie. And also, I do want to hear your thoughts. We've been talking about the primary number one need for a man and the number one need for a woman. And we were talking about how that is for a man to be respected and a woman to be cherished and loved. But I'm interested to hear your thoughts on what you found is most important for you. You can share that now on my Instagram story. I put that question box up there. But one of the questions that I received this past week came from Vanessa. She wrote me an email, and it has to do with being a single mom. And I thought this was an important topic even to bring up during marriage hour. I have worked in and out seeing single moms over the years. I worked for 5 years in a crisis pregnancy center as the director of education outreach. I saw, moms who chose to keep their babies and, parent alone after the life choices they have made. I've seen, in the work I've done, many widows, women who, have been abandoned. You don't know what puts you in the circumstance that you do. And as we talk about that ideal in marriage of, the husband being respected and the primary leader and provider and protector, and the wife having that chief place is written in the encyclical Cassie Canubi, that chief place in the loving within the home, and how important mothers are, especially if you can make that sacrifice. It is such a huge sacrifice for a woman to stay home and cherish those children in those early years. We've talked a lot about this recently on Trending, but that's not always possible for everyone. And I wanted to take this question that came in from Vanessa in my email. She wrote me and she said, I love your show, and especially because you focus on family and support stay-at-home moms. She said, I'm a single mother with no support from the father, but I strongly agree with you that children need their mother. She said, it is very hard for me to stay at home due to me being a mother and a provider. Should I see it in my kids? They are emotionally suffering because of my absence. What advice do you give me? This email just pulled at my heartstrings. And before I say anything else, I know God is a miracle worker, and He, in our brokenness, in our less than ideal situations, He does miracles, and He helps pull us out of the situations we are in. He helps to provide the extra energy, the extra means. He is a miracle worker to make things happen. I was just talking to someone the other day, and they were saying, they wanted the wife and mom to be a stay-at-home mom, but they had to work their way there, and they started praying, and God provided the way to get there. And it's possible, even in dire situations where you are a single mom, maybe all of a sudden this opportunity comes, and your schedule and your adaptability and ability to be more present. Just believe in miracles and pray and abandon this to our Lord. But I have a lot, I think, to talk about within this context, Vanessa, of this question of, here you are, you're a single mom, and you have been called to step into that role as a provider because you do not have the support from the father. And I want to start just by saying I admire moms who are making and meeting the needs of their family and filling the void when they do not have all the support for their kids or for themselves. That's admirable when you are making it happen. No matter how you got there, bad choices, wrong choices, abandonment, you are making it happen, and you're doing what you have to do. I think the first thing, though, from a faith-filled perspective to do after kind of just appreciating, hey, you're making it happen and you're doing what you have to do, is prayer. And when I say prayer, I think part of that, and we'll talk about this concretely, but praying and consecrating yourself and your children to Jesus through the Blessed Virgin Mary and Saint Joseph, surrendering and entrusting your family and your children to their care, knowing that they are going to, through their intercession before the heavenly throne, provide for your family and will truly take care of them. This is where that prayer and that idea of surrender becomes so real. In recognizing that God entrusted you as a mother with these children. He entrusted these children to you. He chose you and wants you to care for them. And even though that care is perhaps not quite as you pictured, now that you're a single mom, that you're having to fill shoes you never thought or hoped or wanted to fill, you're doing it. And I think that we have to have a confidence that God chose you, He gave these children to you, and you have to have confidence in His provisions in the context of the situation you're in. And that doesn't mean He's going to make it easy. And with that, I think that something that we fail to do as a culture today, and I had a dear friend of mine some years ago who said, we have to make sure we pray for provisions for you, in the work that you're doing. It so often, we find ourselves maybe in financial need, maybe in emotional and your spiritual poverty. Maybe, just like you're sharing, you notice, Vanessa, that your kids are suffering emotionally because you're having to fill not just a role of mother, but provider as a single mom. And so I want to encourage you, pray for provisions for your family, but also pray that you have the energy, you have what you need to meet your children's spiritual, emotional, and physical needs. I promise you, you make these prayers, God will equip you. He's going to give you and equip you with what you need. And this is why it's so important that we turn to our Lord, that we are respecting and honoring Him. I keep thinking of that psalm from Sacred Scripture in the Old Testament that Devin Schadt mentioned earlier during the show that reads, "Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart." God answers prayers. He works miracles even in the midst of circumstances that can be so difficult. Uh, and so with that, as you're talking about being a single mom with your kids and you see that they're suffering because you're having to work and you're not able to be as present to them, bring in additional role models. Maybe you already have them, but trusted role models, adults of varying ages, to help fill in and help support as those backup dancers, people who will mom your kids. They can't replace you. They won't replace you, but people who will be motherly to your children, who will be fatherly toward your children, people who will love and cherish your kids because you need that help and support. And so finding those resources, and if you don't know where they're at, pray for them. If you admire people and you think they'd be good role models, ask for help. Pray for God to help give you a means, an opportunity to enter into a conversation with that person, to invite them in. And it could be simple things, incorporating people for dinners that you just wouldn't have otherwise, to help form those relationships. But pray God will send those people. And I keep thinking, in dire situations like this, especially for moms having to fill these other shoes, I think of Our Lady of Sorrows under that title, whose feast we celebrate in September. And I think of Our Lady in that title of Our Lady of Sorrows as she watched her son being scourged, beaten, bruised, bloody, carrying his cross, mocked, humiliated, and then tortured and killed on the cross. She met her son's needs there. She was present to him. Even though she had to watch him endure what she did, she was still there. She loved him, and she did what she could in that moment. And that's the best we're called to. This is Timmerie from Trending with Timmerie. He's back. That is Father Matthew Spencer from St. Joseph's Workshop. Friday, we're going to talk about how to pray with this question of how men are struggling today to pray. All of us could use a tune-up on how to actually make that prayer happen. And this is enlightening as we're coming up on the feast day of St. Joseph the Worker, who shows us a model of work and prayer combined. So join us Friday at 6 p.m. Central on Relevant Radio or the Relevant Radio app.